Today, we'll be hearing from the following folks. Bradley Summerfield with ECCC. Barrie Bonsal is a ECCC researcher, as is Chris Spence. We'll also hear from Erika Hille, who's a PhD candidate at Queen's University and works at the Western Arctic Research Center. Furthermore, I would like to express my gratitude to my colleague at Fuse Consulting, Nikita Rubalek, as well as Carter Gorzitska with ECCC for their support in the development of this webinar.
So the State of the Aquatic Ecosystem Report is meant to occur, I believe, within the agreement every 5 years, and kind of reports on progress of the bilateral agreements between the provinces because the Mackenzie River Basin is so large. We will be dropping the link in the chat for the SOAR report. So if you want to click on that, you can kind of get a better idea. But if you don't know if the basin itself, it encapsulates a large chunk of Alberta, most of the NWT, a bit of the Yukon, a little bit of the northern chunk of Saskatchewan, and then northern BC as well. So it's a very large basin, one of the largest in the world, and has a lot of complex stuff going on. So we're attempting to report on the state of that ecosystem, as well as advance Indigenous community-based monitoring efforts and traditional knowledge, stewardship efforts within the basin, and have been exploring, and trying to create a report that upholds both in a way which can help us have a proper understanding of the actual state of the basin. So you can read more on that link when we send it.
Thanks, Carter. I appreciate that. So before we get started, I'd like to review the process and some ground rules to support a conversation. This meeting will be recorded so that we can post the presentation portion of the meeting to both the ECCC and MRBB's websites. We will not be posting a recording of the discussion anywhere, so please feel free to share your thoughts without fear of being memorialized online. But we will rather use that to inform the report that Nikita and I will be creating based on this webinar. We'll be presenting this report from the webinar to ECCC and MRBB, and once finalized, the report will be posted to their websites for you to access. Some ground rules. Please keep an open mind, listen generously, be respectful of others, and ask questions to gain understanding and clarity. Finally, if you do have questions, please type them into the chat and we'll do our best to get to them. And during the discussion section of the agenda, we'll have an opportunity to unmute to ask questions. Now, on to the main part of the show. Barrie Bonsal will be talking to Western Canadian freshwater availability, current and future vulnerabilities. Barrie is a senior research scientist with the Watershed Hydrology and Ecology Research Division of Environment and Climate Change Canada, based in Saskatoon. He's also an adjunct professor in the departments of geography at the University of Saskatchewan and the University of Manitoba. Barrie obtained a PhD in physical geography from the University of Saskatchewan, where he studied the causes and occurrences of the Canadian prairie droughts. His current research examines the impacts of past climate variability and extremes, including droughts and floods, and projected future climate change in the freshwater resources across Canada. So we now approach the first test of sharing screens. So please, Barrie, take it away and thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. And let's give her a shot here. Okay. Can everybody see that okay? Getting the thumbs up. Okay, and everyone can hear me okay? Thanks very much, Matt. Thanks, Carter, for organizing this. I'm very excited to be a part of this here. And I just want to talk a little bit about some studies that a gaggle of us from Environment and Climate Change Canada have been carrying out. We've been working on Western Canadian freshwater problems and issues for a long time here. And a couple of years ago, we decided to do a study looking at the basins within Western Canada that get most of their water from the snow and ice coming off the Western Cordillera, and looked at it from a couple of angles. You know, what's the water supply, current water supply, projected future supply, and the demand. So looking for a balance between the supply and demand, and trying to assess which areas are going to be more vulnerable in the future based on some of these assessments. Okay, I'm having trouble advancing the slides here.
Do you want to try sharing
There
this?
we go. There we go. Okay. We're good there. So just a little bit of a background for the study here. As I mentioned, the Western Cordillera of Canada, it supplies a lot of fresh water for Western Canada, and this is mainly through the meltwater from snow and ice. And it's been referred to as an alpine water tower. And what we've been seeing in the last few years and projected to continue to occur into the future we're seeing changes to both the seasonality and the amount of this freshwater availability that is coming from these mountain resources. And this fresh water is critical for both societal and environmental flow needs. So along with that, on the supply side, we're seeing current and changing freshwater demands. So there's a strong potential to create future freshwater vulnerabilities within the region. So this study, which we carried out a couple of years ago, synthesizes the current and future freshwater vulnerabilities in terms of both water supply and water demand across major north, west, and east flowing subbasins of the Western Cordillera. And I'll just show you the Western Canadian study area that we're looking at here. And again, this is looking at all of Western Canada. I know we're focusing on the Mackenzie here, and the Mackenzie is a big part of this, but I'm going to talk a little bit about all of Western Canada and focus more on the Mackenzie. So you can see from the map here, we subdivided this into north flowing, west flowing, and east flowing rivers that get all their water off the Western Cordillera. So the major north flowing is, of course, the Mackenzie is the main one there. And you can see the different subregions that we looked at, the Peel, the lower Mackenzie, the Great Bear Lake region, Great Slave region, Liard, Peace, and Athabasca, different color codes on the side. We also looked at west flowing rivers that included some of the areas, mainly the Fraser and Columbia, and some of the areas going into the Pacific Ocean. And also looked at east flowing rivers, which was mainly the Saskatchewan River Basin and the Milk that has some of its area into the headwaters in the US. So these were the main three areas that we looked at this study. For the data on the supply side, we looked at several hydroclimatic data variables, and this included areal average temperature, precipitation, a drought index called the Standardized Precipitation Evapotranspiration Index, and it's generally a water balance indicator that looks at the difference between precipitation and potential evapotranspiration, and the end of the season snow water equivalent. So essentially how much snow is there to melt to give you your spring freshet. For the historical period, we used a gridded data set called CanGrid, which is based on station data across Canada that's been developed by Environment and Climate Change Canada. The trends for the historical period are from 1948 to 2016. Then we also looked at projected future changes, and these were from a set of 29 global climate models that participated in the last IPCC report, International Panel for Climate Change. So the fifth assessment report, the sixth assessment report just came out about a year ago, but these are the models from the fifth report. There was 25 of them. And we looked at two different emission scenarios looking into the future, greenhouse gas emission scenarios. The 2.6, which is a lower emission scenario, which is predicated on that we'll find some alternative future energy sources near mid-century, and emissions will decline thereafter. And the RCP 8.5, which is almost a business as usual scenario as we're going on with greenhouse gases continuing to go at their current pace. And two future periods. We looked at a near future period, which was 2031 to 2050, and a far future period, 2081 to 2100. We also looked at the existing literature to examine some projected changes to seasonal annual runoff and spring freshet timing. And on the demand side, again, we used mostly existing literature, but we looked into things that would relate to environmental flow needs, such as hydroelectricity facilities, industry, fisheries, irrigation, water withdrawals, and land use changes. And those were mostly, again, from existing literature and reports from various sources. For this talk, I'm going to mostly focus on the supply side, and we'll go from there. So, lots of information. It's like we're going to have a game of Keno here, but I'll take you through this here. Essentially, what we have are changes in surface air temperature. And on the left-hand side, maybe you can hopefully see this here. This is looking at the trends for the period 1948 to 2016, and we have them on an annual, spring, summer, autumn, and winter, so seasonal basis and annual. The north-flowing rivers and the subbasins are here. We have the west-flowing rivers and then the east-flowing rivers on the bottom here. And then from this point to the right are looking at projected future changes. This is the near future for the period 2031 to 2050, again, annual, spring, summer, autumn, and winter. And then we go into the far future, and this is looking at the two different emission scenarios, the lower one, the RCP 2.6 and 8.5. And thankfully here, everything is color-coded, which helps to, and kind of shows the greater the degree of warming, the redder the color. And what we can take away from here is if we look at the historical trends, is that we're seeing definitely an increase. You know, there's no blue colors here at all, which would indicate a decrease. And most of this increase is occurring during the winter season. And if we look at the north flowing, west flowing, east flowing, we're seeing that most of the warming is occurring in these north flowing Mackenzie areas. If we go into the future, the near future, again, we're seeing a similar pattern, an additional warming of almost what we've seen over the last 50 years. But going into the far future, it's really emission scenario dependent. So again, if we're on this lower emission side, we're seeing changes that are relatively similar to the ones that occurred in the near future. But if we get this RCP 8.5, the really high emission scenarios, we're seeing very large changes, especially during the winter season, and annual changes, you know, of 5 to 7 degrees Celsius, and we've already, you know, the impacts we're seeing are only around 2 or 3 degrees Celsius. So this is what's happening in terms of historical and projected future surface air temperature. If we move on to precipitation, again, this is color coded with the blue. This is a percentage increase in precipitation. So the blue colors indicate an increase. The red colors, a few of them there, you can see decreases. Again, north flowing, west flowing, east flowing rivers. What we're seeing generally is an increase of precipitation, both annually and during most of the seasons. Historically, in the winter season, we're seeing some decreases, especially in the west and east flowing rivers and in the Athabasca and Peace area, but generally an increase. And this increase, due to the atmospheric warming, is projected to increase both on an annual basis, both in the near future and into the far future. So, and especially with the higher emission scenarios, you can see big percentage increases over here. However, we're also seeing that most of the increases, again, are occurring during more in the colder season, winter, spring, and autumn. In the summer, we're starting to, you know, the increases aren't as big. And in some areas here, especially in the west flowing and east flowing areas, we're actually seeing projected decreases in summer precipitation. And if we go to the Mackenzie area, the southern areas, more the Athabasca, Peace, and Liard, smaller changes as opposed to when we go farther north. So again, the higher increases there. So what's happening there is when we combine the temperature and the precipitation together, and this is where we're looking at this standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index, it's actually a water balance index. So it's looking at the difference between precipitation and evapotranspiration that's mainly due to the temperature increases. And again, here we're just looking at the two different future periods. And the take-home message here is that on an annual basis, because we're seeing those increases more, you know, during the colder season, the blue colors are saying we're going to see an increase in the water balance. There's going to be a little bit more water available, especially in these more northern areas, the Athabasca and the Peace, maybe a slight decrease. But really, what we're seeing here is big changes, big projected changes during the summer season. And that's because even though we may be getting a little bit of an increase in summer precipitation or not much of an increase, it's the increase in summer temperature that's driving the evapotranspiration, and the overall effective precipitation or the water balance is projected to decrease. And this is especially the case when we look at the far future with the high emission scenario in these areas. Again, so the darker the red color, the more the water balance is decreased here. So we're projected to see summer implications across all Western Canadian basins, in fact. Moving on to the next variable we looked at is snow water equivalent. And these are essentially the end of season snow water equivalent. So the amount of snowpack that's available for the spring melt, for the spring freshet that replenishes all the fresh water during the spring season. And here we had a baseline, and this is all based on modeled data from a few GCMs. And for this particular variable, we only had near future changes in the paper with the higher emission scenario. And so these are the baseline amounts in millimeters here. And these are the projected percentage changes in the amount of snow available for melt at the end of the season. And again, you can see that the more southern areas of the Mackenzie, so the Athabasca, Peace, Liard, and even getting in a little bit into the Great Slave, are projected to see a decrease in the amount of snowpack available for spring melt. And as you get a little bit farther north, sorry, I'm having trouble with the mouse here, we're seeing about the same status quo in this area here. Where we're really seeing changes, and again, this isn't the Mackenzie isn't the focus of this particular webinar, but just to point it out here, in these western and eastern flowing areas, we're seeing a big decrease in the snowpack, which could have huge implications for downstream users with the spring freshet. Okay, we also had a couple of basins where there's projected future stream flow, and this is using temperature and precipitation changes from the global climate change models, and then running them through various hydrologic models to get changes in projected stream flow. For the north flowing rivers, had some numbers for the Athabasca, Peace, and Liard. So again, we have a near future and a far future, and a couple of different emission scenarios here, the high emission scenarios on the right. And again, the take-home message here is actually we're going to see an overall increase in the amount of water, but the seasonality is really going to change. And especially we're going to see higher flows during the winter and the colder months of the season, and projected lower flows during the summer season, really when you need a lot of that water. So these are some of the areas of the north flowing. We had a couple of west flowing rivers in the Fraser and stuff here. And again, same take home message, but even bigger decreases in the summer for some of these more southern basins in Western Canada. On the demand side, again, we looked at a lot of the existing literature. I won't go too much into the demand side, but we looked at the current amount of hydroelectric dams for the different north flowing, west flowing, and eastern flowing basins I talked about. When we looked at smaller dams, bigger dams, and really big dams. And again, with the north flowing, there's not too many on there. There's a few on the Great Slave, Athabasca. The Peace has the most regulation on it in terms of the Mackenzie. And again, when we get into these southern areas here, the Fraser and Vancouver Island and the Saskatchewan, there's a lot of hydroelectric dams and diversions in those regions there. So that is increasing the demand potential in that area. So just to kind of synthesize a little bit here, if we look at the southern areas, and again, I didn't focus too much on that there. So, the Fraser, Columbia, Okanagan, Saskatchewan, Milk River, there's a lot of water supply concerns. And we're seeing diminishing snowpack, rapidly diminishing snowpack, receding glaciers. They didn't talk too much about glaciers, but that was in the literature review. Earlier spring freshets and drier summers. And in these areas, we're actually seeing the greatest demands in Western Canada. So, higher populations, a lot of hydroelectric, intensive agriculture, fisheries. So it's really these areas that I think we're going to see the greatest future freshwater vulnerabilities. Now, if we go into the mid-region basins of Western Canada, and this is including some of the more southern basins within the Mackenzie, so the Peace and Athabasca, we're also seeing earlier spring freshets, smaller snowpacks and receding glaciers, and some summer water deficits are beginning to appear here. So, but these supply concerns are a little bit lower than the southern basins I talked about, just because of the higher latitudes at this point in time. Into the future, again, we're going to see those there, and it's a slightly lower demand than what we've seen in the southern areas. But if we move on to the northern areas, the focus of what we talk about here, the main thing we're seeing is higher projected precipitation, overall precipitation. And I think the main water supply issues in these Mackenzie basins primarily relate to how the rapidly changing landscape, and this is mainly associated with permafrost thaws, impacting freshwater quantity and quality. So as this warming continues, these changes in permafrost extent, are going to likely alter the water chemistry. And for example, it might get higher dissolved organic carbon concentrations, which could challenge future community water treatment. We're also seeing an increase in summer temperatures, and even though there might be a corresponding slight increase in precipitation, the water balance is showing that this evapotranspiration is going to overtake the increase in precipitation. So it looks like we might see lower water amounts during the summer season in a lot of the Mackenzie. And for example, this might impact barge operations on the Mackenzie. And in fact, I think there's one study we looked at it in this paper that we did that by mid-century, there might be 17 days less that you can do barge traffic on the Mackenzie. Was one of the studies that they found there. And although populations in the Mackenzie are small, there's still several potential future freshwater demands from possible new industry and maintaining traditional lifestyles. So to summarize, again, I think all of Western Canada are susceptible to freshwater vulnerabilities. And this is due to a lot of different factors that are going on. We're seeing a changing magnitude and frequency of extreme events, floods and droughts, altered aquatic habitats. So we're warming temperatures and an altered seasonality of flow, and landscape changes, mainly due to permafrost thaw. I didn't talk about forest fires, but we're starting to see some increased forest fires and disease in these areas, and wetland drainage. And the main contributing factor to these vulnerabilities is that the current design of the region's water resource system relies on a stable hydrological regime, that where we get a lot of snow and ice. This snow and ice melts in the spring, runs off, replenishes the fresh water, and then we go through that cycle. But we're seeing a lot of changes happening to this snow and ice. And as this quantity and seasonality continue to be altered, I think water scarcity will become an increasingly important issue, especially when we get to regional and local scales. And this will also include the higher possibility of water quality problems, since contaminants will be concentrated in a smaller supply of water that we have during this. And really what we found, in the past, precipitation has really been a dominant control on runoff in most regions. But as we're seeing, it looks like temperature is likely going to become more of a main factor into the future. And so just to conclude, Western Canada and all of Canada for that matter is generally considered water rich, but there's regions of the country that are starting to experience some increased freshwater vulnerabilities. And I think it's important that we steward this resource and anticipate into the future how these changes are going to affect our freshwater supply, which is very, very important. And I'll just thank you there, and I guess entertain any questions or anything, and thank you very much for your attention. And do you want me just to stop sharing then, Matt?
Yes, please, Barrie.
Okay, excellent.
That's great. Thanks, Barrie. I think that was really great. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more, and you touched on them a little bit in your talk. If you could talk a little bit about the impacts on communities and wildlife as this changing water and temperature regimes kind of overtake what we have traditionally thought of as being our cycles in the past.
Well, I think both are going to have to adapt at some point in time, because we're seeing maybe not so much changes in the overall quantity of water. In fact, in the future, there may even be a little bit more water, but it's how this water is being delivered. And whether, we're seeing a lot of it coming from the freshwater snow and ice melt and replenishing everything. And now we're seeing changes to that distribution. A little bit, maybe an earlier melt, so it melts off a little early, a little bit less snowfall. The glaciers that used to replenish things might not be as reliable as we go into the future. we're seeing an impact in, I didn't get into this too much, but there's a projected impact in extreme precipitation events as well, which could really, you know, cause issues again moving future. So we are going to see these changes. The warming is going to happen, even under the lower emission scenarios. We're still going to see some additional warming, and we've already seen some impacts. So we're going to see more impacts. So I think we have to be prepared for that. And again, you know, if we get into the higher emission scenarios, we're going to see higher impacts as well. So we have to be cognizant of that factor as well.
Right. I'm wondering what barriers you face to conducting the research in the Mackenzie Basin specifically, but more generally in the Western Cordillera.
Well, the data are available. You know, we obtained a lot of the data that have been done by other groups within Environment and Climate Change Canada, and they've actually faced barriers in trying to put it together, these data sets, especially when we get into the north. There's sparser data collection and sparser. So even though we're able to get gridded data sets for these regions, they're based on fewer stations. So I think the uncertainty is a little bit greater. So we have to keep that in mind, that when we go into looking at some of these variables, that the uncertainty is higher in some of these regions.
Right. So for me, that's an interesting question in terms of how we might fill some of those gaps in the data, and how communities in the north might be able to engage with researchers to help fill those gaps. Yes,
definitely. I think we have to collaborate and get more information from the people who are living there to augment our measurements and get a better flavor of you know, some of the extreme events and stuff like that, how they may impact or what's happening on the landscape. Definitely.
Right. I'm wondering if anyone else on the webinar has any questions. We have a few minutes here. If folks want to unmute and ask a question, I think that would be appropriate. No? All right, well, let me ask you, oh, okay. Hi, Leon.
Hi, good morning. Good afternoon, rather. Very interesting to hear you, Barrie. I'm just wondering just if you have any data you can tell us in the past 10 summers or 10 winters in the past, all indication that the trend is slowly going to the direction you're talking about, increasing or decreasing. I just want to ask that question. Thank you.
Okay, so just to be clear, so you're asking over the last 10 years, are we seeing an accelerated change, like even more change than what was shown? Is that what you were asking?
Yes.
Yeah, we've definitely seen, and there's been a couple of reports out now that I think in the last 10 years, 8 of them have been the warmest on record globally. And then when you look at the map of these changes, and again, they show the red colors, mostly red, there's a couple of blue colors, but the deep reds are over the Arctic regions. So over them, especially over the Mackenzie and actually the Arctic regions right around the Northern Hemisphere. So that is where we're seeing the biggest changes. And yes, they tend to be happening faster and faster, I think, as time is going on. And this is projected to continue and maybe even accelerate into the future. And it's interesting when we get into these northern landscapes, and you know, the snow and ice normally would reflect a lot of that sunlight. We call it albedo. And as we see a shortening of the winter season, maybe a little bit longer, we're seeing more bare ground and bare ocean in those areas. And it's actually increasing. We call it an Arctic amplification of the warming. So as we remove the snow and ice, we're actually seeing an increase in temperature at accelerated rates compared to other regions of the globe that don't have snow and ice so much of the year.
Great. Great question, Leon. Oh, sorry, Leon, I muted you. I'll unmute you here. You're still muted, Leon. I'm sorry.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you. I was just wondering, it is the trend. So thank you very much. I'll see.
Great. Thank you, Leon.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question. Appreciate it.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions that are in the chat. Number one, Dan was asking if there's a publication available that covers this work. And I assume there is, Barrie, and is that something that we can share as a link in the report when we put the report out?
Yes, definitely. It was published in 2020 in a journal called Environmental Reviews, and I can certainly send that link to you, Matt, and we can make it available to everybody. Yes, definitely.
Great. Okay, and then one final question. Thanks, Dan, and on to Brendan. Brendan writes, perhaps I misunderstood, but I thought I read that lower water levels were anticipated for northern Canada because of higher atmospheric temperature. Is that correct? If so, will this override increased base flows because of increased groundwater discharge due to degrading permafrost?
Excellent question. And it's all about a water balance study. And again, what I talked is fairly large scale, and it's looking at very large scales. And it's looking at average conditions too. It's looking at a 20 or 30 year average condition. So from year to year, this can definitely change. But on average, yes, once we see these warmer temperatures, we're going to get a little bit more evapotranspiration, evaporation, which is going to lower the water levels. What we get from base flow, I think it depends on what regions you're looking at, or this increase, though, how much it's going to increase the water levels. This would take some hydrologic modeling that goes a little bit beyond what we did there, but I think it's going to be it has to balance, and I think on regional areas you might see some differences. I don't know if I'm answering your question very well here, but essentially, it's going to be a balance. And I think maybe some of the speakers later on who are talking a bit more about permafrost thaw and changes in the flow regimes can answer this a little bit better. But definitely we're going to see an impact from the warming temperatures. How much that's offset from some of these other factors on more local and regional scales remains to be seen.
Great. Thanks, Barrie, and thanks, Brendan, for the question. I think that's it for you, Barrie.
Wow.
So you're off the hook until the discussion. Now, Chris, you're up. So our next speaker is Chris Spence. Chris was born in Hanna, Alberta, and raised in Regina. Chris holds a BA and MSc from the University of Regina and a PhD from McMaster University. He works as a research scientist for Environment and Climate Change Canada in Saskatoon. He holds an adjunct professor appointments at the University of Saskatchewan and Manitoba. His research focuses on better understanding hydrologic and hydrometeorologic process in cold regions for environmental prediction systems and policy development. His field studies have taken him across Canada, but these days his focus is on the Canadian Shield and Prairie, as well as the Laurentian Great Lakes. Away from work, he enjoys mountain biking, backpacking, and drumming with the Calgary Police Service Pipe Band. Chris's talk is Climate Warmings and Permafrost Hydrology in the Taiga Shield, Expected and Unexpected Findings. Hey, Chris, are you there?
Yep. Hi.
Awesome. Can I suggest that you start your camera and try this screen sharing?
Sure.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks great.
I think I might keep the video off for now because the presentation kind of occupies the screen, I think, when we speak during Zoom. Is that all right? Just to keep the video off?
100%, Chris. I'm wondering if you could speak up a little bit, though, please.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for for the opportunity to present this today. It's really a team effort. A lot of this work is actually supported by Environment Canada and Northern Water Futures through the Global Water Futures Program. So I've listed some names of some key people that are leading different parts of this study. That includes Anna and Jen from Laurier, Anna Coles from the GNWT and our water resources, Steve at the Geoscience Office, and Nia and Oliver at the University of Montreal. The other thing I'd like to acknowledge that a lot of this work, well, actually all of the work, takes place just outside of the city of Yellowknife. This is Chief Dry Geese territory and sort of the traditional lands of the Yellowknife's Dene, though the Clecho and the North Slave Métis also have strong ties to this land. So thanks to everybody. I'll get started with some background. Barrie touched on some of this about climate warming and permafrost, and I probably don't need to say this too much to this crowd, but it's well documented that permafrost thaw is already pretty widespread in the Northwest Territories, sort of across the circumpolar, pan-Canadian. We expect this trend to continue. Some estimates, based on remote sensing and some modeling, expect that we'll lose another 1 million square kilometers of permafrost by the end of the century. And I have trouble wrapping my head around what that looks like, but it's an obscene amount of land, actually. And we expected there to be some pretty significant impacts, just cascade through different environmental systems because of this. And again, Barrie touched on some of this, and I think Erika is going to follow as well. And I noticed that Ryan's on the line, but he was able to show that the influence of permafrost loss on runoff pathways in the Taiga Shield. Steve was able to show what this means for sediment concentrations and subsequently in chemical loads to water bodies. So understanding how climate warming influences permafrost and how that cascades through water resources systems is really important for how we live and use this water, this resource. Again, it's this documentation of permafrost loss has been done across northern Canada, but much of it is based on some small scales, or not all of it, but some of it's based on small scale studies in specific landscapes. And I'm going to lean again here on the Taiga Plains and the stuff that's been done around Scotty Creek and Fort Simpson. And this image here, you sort of see different maps of permafrost versus permafrost-free areas. And it's clear the white areas are growing as you get this loss of permafrost and the change of land cover associated with where you're losing the peat plateaus and you're growing bogs and fens. So it's a pretty substantial change there. However, one thing we know is that when you expand out from these areas, I mean, this is a map of sort of the permafrost regions of Canada, and the Mackenzie Basin's part of it. But there's a diversity of landscape types across this region, and not everything looks like Fort Simpson, and so we really shouldn't expect that water resources availability or the chemistry to respond the same way. So we have to recognize that there's this diversity, and this kind of shows up in this map. Sometimes I wish I'd used a different color scale, but that variation from the yellow to the red shows maybe how this might vary over space, over quite a large area. So this is something that we need to consider, that, okay, we can't take what we know from the Taiga Plains and expand it elsewhere, because it probably isn't going to manifest the same. And this is just sort of hammering home this point. If you look at satellite imagery of two places, like the Taiga Plains and for instance, the Taiga Shield, where we're going to show results from, you shouldn't expect a similar kind of response. You know, there's less overburden in the Shield, there's more lakes, the climate's a little different. So we have to, I guess my point is that it's important to study different landscapes to see how each of these is going to respond. And so that's what we did. And I'm going to start with Anna's work. Actually, through much of this this presentation, you're only going to see a little bit of what I've led, and a lot more of what other people have led. And Anna's done a ton of heavy lifting, looking at land cover change in some places just north of Yellowknife, in a research catchment we have around Baker Creek. And she looked at imagery from 1972 and 2017 and mapped the changes in land cover from these areas, and classified things into, I think, 5 or 6 categories: exposed rock, open water, wetlands, and sparse forest and dense forest. And what she really noted is this tree infilling was quite striking in many places, where in 1972 there was a lot of places that were wetlands, such as this area here, that are now growing trees here and becoming sparse forest. And there's areas that were sparse that are now dense, which is sort of like, this was sparse forest here, and now there's a dense forest in here. So the other thing that's important, and this will come up later, is that she was also able to take some measurements to try to identify the presence or absence of permafrost in each of these areas. And this is kind of a convoluted graph, but the take-home message from this is that wetlands are typically permafrost free, and dense and sparse forests tend to have permafrost in place. Basically this big bar here, and these are the numbers of samples. So out of the 68 measurements in the wetland, 64 had no, only 3 of them were found to have permafrost, versus these kinds of ratios in these other sections. So this will come back, be an important point later in the talk. So if there are more trees, that begs a great question, is like, well, what does that mean for water resources? So what we have is 2 climate towers, one surrounded by sparse forest. This is up in here, and another one that's got far more trees in the tower footprint. So the tower sits maybe here, and this is kind of what it sees below it, and same with the sparse one above. And what we found was that more trees doesn't necessarily mean more evaporation. It's not that, or more evapotranspiration. It's not that simple. It goes, what seems to be happening is that a dense forest kind of interacts with the atmosphere differently than a sparse one does. And this, sorry about this, but this omega term is kind of indicative of that. And what it means is if it's lower, then the transpiration is more responsive to the condition of the atmosphere, in the sense of how dry it is, the air temperature, that kind of thing, versus the radiation, sort of how much sunlight and long wave radiation is hitting the tree canopy. So what you end up getting between a landscape like this and a landscape like this is a very different interaction between the trees and the atmosphere. And so one would think, because of the source of water for this transpiration comes from the soil, that this will impact what's going on with soil moisture. And so Anna Coles with the GNWT a number of years ago, 2018 and 2019, took part in a pretty intensive sampling campaign where she measured precipitation and trees, shrubs, and soils for their isotope content to try to figure out if there are significant differences. And some of the take-home messages from this are like, if this is the isotopic signature in snow, and these are sort of samples from rain, what we find is that the water in the trees and the shrubs at the beginning of the season is kind of this mixture of this snow and the previous year's rain. But as it starts to rain, they start to emulate the signatures in the trees and the shrubs start to emulate the type of water that's coming out of the sky relatively recently. So, and since we got different patterns from 2018 to 2019, and there was way more rain in 2018, what we're starting to glean from this is that the type of water that vegetation is using may depend on the moisture conditions. So a couple of takeaways from this is that it seems like vegetation is really opportunistic about what it uses and from what soil depths it uses. And this may change between seasons. So we're just starting to get into this data. I'm finding it super interesting as well as super confusing. And so there's a lot of interesting things going on here in terms of what a change in sort of forest density might mean for soil moisture, and subsequently how the water cycles through the catchment in this region. The other thing that Anna found is that when she mapped all the changes across all her sort of 31 sample areas and said, okay, if something turned from wetland to sparse forest or dense forest, let's say that's associated because of the permafrost or lack of permafrost that's associated with those land cover types. Say, for an instance, a change from wetland to sparse forest is associated with a gain in permafrost, while a transition from sparse forest to wetland is associated with a loss of permafrost. And if you didn't change, say you went from dense to sparse, that was considered stable permafrost. When you add up all these areas, this is the gain, this is the loss. There's actually a net permafrost gain across the Baker Creek catchment between 1972 and 2017. Not much, less than 5% of the area, but it was still, given all the other documentation in the Mackenzie Basin about permafrost loss, this finding we found to be quite striking. So we're trying to figure out, okay, well, if that is the case, where are these areas and where are these areas across the catchment? And what Anna found is that if this is sort of her 31 sample areas, and this is location A, and these are the two images from A, and this is B, and these are the two images from B, and this is the permafrost change. So all these areas lost permafrost. And B is a really good example because here is a forest patch. This is probably a Lathalsa, so big chunk, and it's gone. It's been overcome and it's kind of flooded area now in 2017. But A, you see a lot of this growth along the edges in around in here and on these edges of this wetland is becoming sparse forest. And what she was able to find is that this mean flow accumulation is basically can be interpreted as these are higher areas in the watershed and these are lower areas in the watershed. So these are sort of high hill slopes and these are lower lower streams, and you can sort of see that's indicative of this being in the picture. So what we're finding is that there are certain areas that are sort of high and dry that are kind of prone to permafrost degradation if climate conditions are right. And she was able to document like 5 or 6 periods in the late 60s and early 70s that may have been sort of permafrost creating climate years. And so this might be why this is happening. But down in this area, there's so much advected water and energy in these areas that they tend to lose a lot of this. They're particularly prone to permafrost loss. So just kind of to wrap things up a little bit, in this part of the world, it seems like the land cover change associated with warming is most associated with tree infilling. So it's not shrubification. We're well below the tree line here, so it's not tree line expansion, but there are more trees than there were before. And our observations and sampling from isotopic signatures in the precipitation, the soil, and the vegetation have been able to help us determine how the water cycle might change in this landscape. But we're still picking that apart, and there's lots of unanswered questions, but they're super interesting. And it would seem that some areas in this part of the world are prone to either degradation of permafrost. These are sort of low, wet areas, or aggradation, sort of higher, drier areas. I'm going to qualify this statement as well, though, by saying this is sort of from the early 70s to the late 2010s. And one thing Anna noted was that when she looked back through the climate record, there haven't been a lot of sort of trigger years for permafrost degradation since like the 90s. So it might be that the aggradation period is over and everything's going to be continually degrading. It's hard to say, but it kind of points to sort of the long lags in the system that permafrost might have as it adjusts to climate shifts. The other point that I'd kind of like to drive home a little bit is that because we notice differences in how different parts of the landscape respond to climate warming and changes in permafrost in sort of that are dependent on their sort of geometry and location on the landscape. When we want to sort of upscale this to larger streams that maybe we care about a little bit more, or then the response to those larger scale streams is probably going to depend on the spatial distribution of these changes. So one thing I might recommend moving forward is that mapping is super important, and trying to understand that just understanding the vertical fluxes of water up and down isn't going to be enough. We have to understand how that water moves across the landscape and influences frozen ground and chemistry as well. So I'll just wrap up there, but thanks everybody.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chris. So given that we have about 15 minutes where we can have a brief discussion about your talk specifically, you touched on this, Chris, and before we start getting a flow of questions into the chat, I was wondering if you could speak to what your future research desires are and what challenges you see in the field.
Well, I think I guess in the short term, we still we would I think we need to work through the current data that we have. COVID kind of put a damper on some things the last few years, our ability to kind of spend some time on this. But I think if we can get through this last batch of sort of micrometeorology and isotope data, that might springboard us into some other work. It would be nice to do some, I guess, do some of the permafrost hydrology work that like Ryan made famous at Fort Simpson on the Taiga Shield, because I think looking at different landscapes is going to be important to help us understand some of the impacts of some of the warming that Barrie was talking about, and what that means sort of at smaller scales. You know, Barrie was talking about some big catchments, and I'm talking about some pretty small areas. Arguably, it's that space in the middle that water managers and communities find most challenging. So that kind of transferring information across scales is probably going to be a bit of a I don't want to call it a knowledge gap, but I'll just call it an opportunity.
Right.
Yeah.
So then, like, speaking about transferring knowledge, how do you see your work impacting policymakers, and maybe even infrastructure like water treatment plants, et cetera, as we lose more permafrost through the future?
Well, that's a big question, Matthew. The transferring knowledge from my desk to a policymakers is always been is always a challenge, right? So, or anybody's desk like mine, whether it's Erika's or Barrie's, right? Because I guess it's important to try to have conversations as early on as possible about needs and interests, so that research can be relevant to those policy people. And the other thing I've learned over the years is that it has to be in a form that's like ingestible, right? And me writing a paper isn't necessarily the most ingestible way to transfer that knowledge to policymakers. So again, COVID hasn't been kind to us in this ways, but having discussions with people early on and through the research process is really important to learn what people would like to do, or what information people need, and in what form they best receive it. So I don't know, I'm not sure I danced around that question or not, but I hope that was.
No, well, I think that what you're identifying is, and you identified it directly, it's a huge gap and a real challenge to go from specific research, particularly at a smaller scale, to policy, and it takes years and many different studies that you build up a knowledge base over time so that you can start impacting policy. So yeah, it's a huge challenge. Yeah,
no, and we expect like chemistry flows and chemistry of the water to change with these kinds of things. But exactly how they're going to change is a tricky question to address. And on the policy side, I often ask policymakers or decision makers, okay, what information could, if I brought to you, would actually change your decision or change how you designed the policy, right? If you knew that dissolved organic carbon was going to start to average 20 milligrams a liter would that change how you designed your water treatment plant?
Right.
And if they say, well, no, I say, okay, well, then you don't have anything to worry here, right? But it's what are those sort of tipping, I don't want to call them tipping points, but those things that might tip a decision one way or the other are probably really valuable things to know in this conversation.
Right. Well, Chris, we don't have anything in the chat for you. So I do really appreciate your time and your talk. And if you can stick around for the discussion piece, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Our next speaker is Erika Hille, whose talk is titled Characterizing the Water Quality Response of Fluvial Systems to Changes in Landscape and Permafrost Conditions. Erika is currently a PhD candidate at Queen's University, supervised by Doctors Melissa Lafreniere and Scott Lamoureux. Her PhD is funded by the Garfield Weston Family Foundation, a doctoral award in Northern Research. She's an NSERC scholar, the Alexander Graham Bell Canadian Graduate Scholarship, and by the Permafrost Network of Canada. Erika also works at the Western Arctic Research Centre, the headquarters of the Aurora Research Institute, as a special projects coordinator. She is responsible for developing and leading research programs in hydrology and water chemistry. Erika also oversees long-term monitoring programs. In addition, Erika represents the Aurora Research Institute on a number of committees, including the Northwest Territories Regional Contaminants Committee, Climate Change Preparedness in the North, and the International Network for Terrestrial Research and Monitoring in the Arctic. Finally, Erika acts as a director, the Western Arctic Research Center during the summer months. In this capacity, she oversees all of the ARI's research programs on logistical operations. You sound like a very busy person, Erika, and I'm really glad that you're able to make some time to join us today. If you could please unmute, awesome, and start sharing your screen. We'd appreciate that.
Great, thank you. I will try. Great. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for the introduction and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for setting aside the time to be here today. My name is Erika Hille, and I'm going to discuss my PhD research project, which is entitled Characterizing the Response of Fluvial Systems to Changes in Landscape and Permafrost Conditions. I'm working under the co-supervision of Dr. Melissa Lafreniere and Dr. Scott Lamoureux from the Department of Geography and Planning at Queen's University. I also work in close collaboration with Dr. Steve Coquel from the Northwest Territories Geological Survey. There. The majority of my research is located in the Beaufort Delta region of the Northwest Territories. The Beaufort Delta is situated within a region of continuous permafrost. The permafrost in this region is characteristically ice-rich, containing large volumes of massive ice. This includes remnants of glacial ice as well as ice wedge ice. Spatial variability in the volumetric ice content of the permafrost in this region is strongly associated with the glacial history of the terrain, as well as with vegetation distribution, which can be highly variable across the region, and ground temperature. Large areas of the landscape were glaciated during the Wisconsin glaciation. Deglaciation was initiated in the early Holocene, which was a period of warming. In the late Holocene, however, the climate began to cool. This delayed deglaciation and allowed for glacial ice to be preserved in the permafrost of massive ice, which is the most abundant along glacial margins. Ice wedge ice is another form of massive ice that is common to the region. The size and frequency of ice wedge ice is directly linked to vegetation. As we move northwards across the region, the dominant vegetation transitions from forested to shrub to tundra. With this transition comes a notable decrease in snow accumulation and in turn ground temperature. As ground temperature decreases, the size of ice wedge ice increases. Notably, these large volumes of massive ice are only insulated by a thin 0.1 to 1.2 meter layer of soil that thaws seasonally, called the active layer. This has made the terrain particularly vulnerable to thaw-driven landscape change. Disturbances that expose massive ice, such as construction, development, fire, thermal and mechanical erosion, and landslides, lead to the thawing of massive ice. And thawing can also occur when the thermal perturbation of permafrost expands the active layer into massive ice features. Historical and contemporary thawing of massive ice has transformed the landscape of the Beaufort Delta. Contemporary thaw in particular has led to unprecedented landscape change. In addition to physical disturbances to the permafrost, there is also evidence of thermal perturbation to the permafrost. The term thermokarst is widely used to describe all processes and landforms that are associated with melting ground ice. The physical manifestation of thermokarst, however, is highly variable. The two thermokarst landscapes that I will be focusing on are polygonal terrain and retrogressive thaw slumping. Ice wedge ice typically forms in a network of polygons and is commonly associated with low relief peatland terrain. An example of polygonal terrain can be seen in the photograph on the left. This is an example of high-centered polygonal terrain. Although the high-centered polygons are evidence of ice wedge degradation, the ice wedge ice in the southern Beaufort Delta region is actually quasi-stable, or it isn't currently degrading. In high relief areas, such as the shoreline of lakes and rivers, the thawing of glacial ice can lead to retrogressive thaw slumping. Retrogressive thaw slumping occurs when buried massive ice is exposed, which leads to thaw and landscape destabilization. An example of a retrogressive thaw slump can be seen in the photo on the top right. This is actually a retrogressive thaw slump that formed over a period of about 2 weeks this past field season, and you can see how the slump has expanded into the adjacent water body. Retrogressive thaw slumping has set the context for the vast majority of water quality studies in this region. A good example of this is actually my MSc project. As a master's student, I contributed to a research program looking at the effects of retrogressive thaw slumping on small tundra lakes in the upland region east of the Mackenzie Delta. I focused on a pair of lakes. 5A was pristine and 5B had a large retrogressive thaw slump on its shoreline. These lakes are situated within the Knoll Lake catchment east of the Inuvik-to-Tuktoyaktuk Highway. My research built on a suite of previous work comparing the water quality, aquatic biology, and lake ice conditions of slump-impacted lakes with unaffected lakes. My research focused on examining the seasonal geochemistry of the lake and the contributing catchment, as well as the hydrology. After my MSc was complete and I was working at the Western Arctic Research Center, we continued to sample Lake 5A and 5B, and we now have a data set about 15 years long, which in the context of water quality studies in this region is really quite robust. So a lot of what we learned from the Tundra Upland Lakes project has informed our current research on fluvial systems. Coquel et al. Found that slump-impacted lakes have higher concentrations of mineral ions than unaffected lakes, and that this remains true long after the slump has been active. The persistence of slump impacts on lake geochemistry is driven by landscape runoff, which mobilizes fine clay particles. Lake geochemistry is also controlled by hydrological and climatic factors, which are strongly linked to the seasonal and interannual variability that we see in lake geochemistry. This includes the magnitude and intensity of spring snowmelt, summer rainfall events, evaporation, and ice formation. In contrast with the trends that we saw with mineral ions, and perhaps in contrast with what was expected to be seen, slump-impacted lakes actually had lower concentrations of dissolved organic carbon than unaffected lakes. This was associated with the adsorption of dissolved organic carbon onto fine clay particles that were released from the retrogressive thaw slump. Dissolved organic carbon adsorbed to fine clay particles, which then settled at the lake bottom. So a key question coming out of this project, and then also one that Chris had raised, is can retrogressive thaw slumping be used as an analog for permafrost thaw? How variable are the impacts of permafrost thaw on landscapes and on freshwater systems? So the water quality of Arctic freshwater systems is intrinsically linked to the contributing landscape. The biogeochemical response of aquatic systems to permafrost thaw is determined by not only the nature and magnitude of thermokarst, but also on terrain conditions such as parent material, vegetation, relief, and hydrologic connectivity. As a result, water quality can vary spatially in response to changes in the landscape and temporally in response to seasonal variability in precipitation, thaw, and flow pathways. How permafrost and terrain conditions influence water quality and how this varies temporally is still poorly understood for Arctic regions. So this brings me to my research goal. For my doctoral thesis, I will examine how and why the water quality impacts of permafrost thaw manifest in 4 contrasting permafrost landscapes. The 4 study sites I will be focusing on are a suite of peatland streams along the Inuvik-to-Tuktoyaktuk Highway, the Minor River, which is situated along the margins of previously glaciated terrain. This can be described as ice marginal glacial terrain. The Wrangling River, which is located south of Inuvik. It is a headwater catchment of the Mackenzie River, located south of treeline and draining predominantly trevally and upland terrain. And then also for my PhD, I will be looking at the Neokunguk River near Iqaluit. However, I will not be discussing that in this presentation. So to address this research question, my general research approach is to examine the seasonal hydrology and geochemistry of 4 contrasting stream and river networks. I will then be characterizing the contributing catchment based on key terrain features and permafrost conditions using detailed terrain and information obtained from unmanned aerial systems and high-resolution satellite imagery. I will then attempt to explain changes in the water quality both within and between catchments using these terrain conditions. And then finally, I will utilize new and published data to develop a conceptual framework for characterizing the response of Arctic stream and river networks to changes in terrain from permafrost conditions. So this project has 4 themes. The first theme is to identify the terrain features that drive spatial variability in carbon and nutrient transport to and through low Arctic polygonal terrain. On the left-hand side is a map of the Inuvik-to-Tuktoyaktuk Highway. The ITH is a 138-kilometer all-weather road constructed on continuous permafrost. High-centered polygonal terrain is common along this corridor and is typically associated with low-relief peatland landscapes, which are characteristically rich in organic deposits. Due to the latitudinal gradient, the vegetation ranges from shrub to tundra vegetation. As a result, snow accumulation and ground temperature decreases from south to north. This is coupled with an increase in the size and frequency of ice wedge ice. So samples were collected this past summer and are currently being analyzed at the Facility for Biogeochemical Research on Environmental Change in the Cryosphere at Queen's University. However, I thought I would include some kind of initial observations I've made based on the data that I do have. So it does appear that there is a range of dissolved organic carbon and nutrient concentrations across the 11 peatland stream sites, despite them being in rather close proximity. It also appears that streams with similar landscape characteristics have similar dissolved organic carbon and nutrient profiles. Based on this, we anticipate that variability in dissolved organic carbon and nutrient concentrations is closely linked to vegetation, relief, water residence time, and the magnitude of ice wedge degradation within the catchment. The current challenge we're facing is how do we upscale this to larger aquatic networks? So how does this integrate into larger aquatic systems? To attempt to answer this, theme 2 will examine the cumulative effects of ice wedge degradation and retrogressive thaw slumping on the chemistry of the minor river. So a much larger system also impacted by numerous peatland streams. The minor river, on the left-hand side of this slide is a map of the minor river. It drains a relatively organic rich catchment. The southern end is situated below tree line. Flowing northwards, the vegetation covering the contributing catchment transitions to shrub and then to tundra. At the northern stretch of the river, high-centered polygonal terrain is common. And much like the ITH, the high-centered polygonal terrain is associated with low relief, organic rich areas. In contrast with the ITH, however, there are numerous retrogressive thaw slumps along the deeply incised shoreline. So a preliminary analysis of the data and observations in the field indicate that retrogressive thaw slumping can rapidly modify downstream water quality by mobilizing large amounts of organic and mineral sediment. This is very similar to what researchers are seeing in the Peel Plateau region, south of Inuvik, as well in other regions of the Arctic, such as the Cape Bounty Arctic Watershed Observatory. We've also noticed that since the minor river is generally slow moving and meandering, the sediment concentrations appear to exceed the carrying capacity of the river. So sediment is deposited along the banks of the river and in some cases has blocked off entire tributaries. In addition to retrogressive thaw slumping, the water quality of the minor river is also strongly influenced by peatland stream tributaries. So we are seeing that dissolved organic carbon concentrations do increase in response to the confluence with these peatland stream tributaries. And this is kind of what we expected to see. And in fact, a key question that we had associated with this theme was, do the fine clay particles from retrogressive thaw slumping temper the effects of peatland streams on the concentration of dissolved organic carbon in the minor river? And if yes, this would be in line with what we'd observed in the small tundra lakes and what researchers are observing in the Peel Plateau region. So to answer this question, we sampled before and after a suite of retrogressive thaw slumps along the main channel of the minor river. The retrogressive thaw slumps had full connectivity to the main stem of the river. In contrast with what we'd expected to see, retrogressive thaw slumping does not appear to influence dissolved organic carbon concentrations in the minor river. So my challenge now is to try and answer why that might be. So the third theme will examine the effects of recent climate change and permafrost thaw on an Arctic river not influenced by physical disturbance to the permafrost. So the site I'll be using to answer this question is the Wrangling River. The Wrangling River is a tributary of the minor river. It's situated south of Inuvik, below tree line. The contributing catchment has low to high relief, and similar to the previous two landscapes, it's rich in organic deposits. The Wrangling River is still situated within a region of continuous permafrost. However, the contributing catchment does not contain evidence of physical disturbances to the landscape. Also, in contrast with the previous two landscapes, the permafrost in this area can be characterized as warm permafrost, making it particularly vulnerable to thermal perturbation. In fact, the hydrological record suggests that thermal perturbation to the contributing catchment is actually influencing groundwater flow pathways to the river. More specifically, within the past 3 years, we've started to see winter stream flow, which wasn't present before. So a key component of this theme is to characterize winter stream flow. How does it differ from the rest of the year? And what does this tell us about the hydrology of the contributing catchment? As we expected, there was a marked increase in the concentration of total dissolved solutes and mineral ions over the winter period. This is associated with groundwater flow through the deeper mineral soil horizons. This could be indicative of talc formation. So that is when the active layer, the layer of soil above the permafrost that thaws seasonally, has expanded into the mineral soil horizons. And in some cases, when it expands a lot, it won't freeze back in winter. Alternatively, it could suggest an increase in the connectivity of the river with groundwater flow pathways flowing beneath the permafrost, or both. Given this, we anticipated that there would be a decrease in dissolved organic carbon over the winter months as groundwater flow pathways transition to mineral soil horizons. This would be in line with other observations made in other Arctic rivers that have seen similar trends in terms of increasing Arctic river and stream flow. This was not the case. Dissolved organic carbon actually appears to be higher in the late winter months. So to ascertain where this DOC was coming from, we used radiocarbon dating to age the DOC. We found that the dissolved organic carbon in the Regling River was modern over the spring and summer months. However, in the late summer and over fall and winter, the age of the carbon progressively increased. This suggests that groundwater flow is mobilizing older carbon from deep in the soil profile that was potentially sequestered in the permafrost before. So the challenge that faces us now is to determine where this groundwater is coming from. So the first and final theme will be to develop a conceptual framework for characterizing the sensitivity and response of Arctic streams and rivers to permafrost thaw. This has two broad objectives. The first will be to conduct a thorough literature review on studies examining the effects of permafrost thaw, terrain, hydrologic, and climatic conditions on the chemistry of Arctic rivers. And the second will be to synthesize the new information we obtained for themes 1 to 3 with existing information available in the literature to develop a conceptual framework that characterizes the sensitivity and response of Arctic rivers to regional variability in catchment conditions. And that brings me to the end of my presentation.